people are not going to be able to hear anything, but now they can. Okay, cool. Awesome sauce. Alrighty, folks. How about we start this over? Okay. So before I get started, how many people, I would imagine most people, use Drupal 8? Yeah, okay, good. It's better than my session at the con. Anybody done a custom module? Anybody done a custom entity? Okay, cool. Well, then this should be a lot of fun. Anybody that is comfortable with object-oriented programming in general? Okay, nice. So that's kind of what this is about. So entities 201, creating custom entities. We're going to go through this example, and we're going to create a module with a custom entity and use that to kind of talk through some of the different pieces, some of the different systems we work with. And I'll talk about kind of my process as I go through this, and then also how I figured out how to do this. Hint, I just copy and paste a lot. That's kind of my secret. So I'm Ron Northcutt. I've been doing Drupal for a while at a bunch of different levels. I'm at Acquia. I'm online as RL Northcutt in most places, except G+ for some reason. I don't even know. So today we're going to go through and we're going to talk about the tools that you need and the setup for what we're going to do today. And then we're going to generate a basic custom entity in under 5 minutes. Actually takes like maybe 2. Just because in my DrupalCon session I said that I would do that, show people how to create a custom entity under 5 minutes. Kind of a kitschy little thing, it worked. And then we'll take a look at some of the basic code that comes out of that and how that works without touching anything. That's just a few minutes, and then we'll kind of dive into a more complex example that kind of is actually a little bit more interesting. So the first thing is tools and setup. So you're going to need a local development environment. I'm using Dev Desktop here, which works pretty well. You can also use Drupal VM, or you can roll your own, WAMP, MAMP, all that fun stuff. Some type of base site, just stock Drupal should be fine. I'm using Lightning. Drupal console, which is kind of it's a command line tool, kind of like Drush, only different, based on Symfony console. Everybody familiar with that? Heard it, maybe? It's actually very powerful, does a lot of really interesting, cool things, as we're going to see today. And interesting note, I actually just found out at the con that when Drupal console generates the scaffolding code for a plugin or an entity or whatever you're asking it to do, that pattern is actually stored as a twig template in Drupal console. So if you have something that you'd like to see Drupal console help you do, it's actually not that hard to stick that stuff in place, which is actually kind of cool. And then some type of IDE or text editor. I'm going to use PHP Storm, even though it's a memory hog, because it'll tell me if I do something wrong, which I actually did during DrupalCon, and it caught me. So that saved me from looking too stupid, which was nice. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a basic entity called a thingy. And a thingy is just that. For those who remember my session on Entities 101, an entity is a loadable thingy that's optionally fieldable, so I figured it was suiting. So the steps are pretty simple. First, we have to generate a module for it to live in. Then we actually generate the entity, take a look and see kind of what spits up from that. And then the final step is we'll turn it on, make sure it doesn't blow up, and see what the results are. The commands we're going to be using for Drupal console are pretty simple. And then we'll be using Drush. You can actually enable modules with Drupal console, I think, but I still use Drush because that's what I'm used to. And that's it. Pretty simple, pretty fast. So let's take a look at this, and we will get started. Everybody see this okay? A little bit bigger, maybe. There we go. Okay, so I'm in the doc root for my local environment. So if you take a look at the list of things that the Drupal console lets you do, it's quite sizable. So my system is running very slow today. It's because I turned on PHP Storm. There we go. So there's a lot of really cool things that you can do. And most of what I've used it for has predominantly been around writing code. Like if I needed a plugin or something like that, this makes it really easy to do. But there's a ton of power here that not everybody uses. So definitely want to look into that. So the first thing we want to do is we want to generate a module. There we go. And then we're just going to go through and answer a series of questions, and then it's going to spit out the code. So this is where it's taking in the variables that it's going to fill into the Twig template that will then generate the code from. So we're going to call this thingy. Machine name is the same. It's custom. Thingies for all. Custom package. We don't need a module file, so well, we'll just keep it. Don't want it to be a feature. Don't need a composer. Don't have any dependencies. Don't want any tests today. And we don't need a template. So there's a lot of cool things it's asking you to do that you can have a lot of cool code spit out. In this case, as we can see here, it's actually created this. And there we go. Very simple, very basic, which honestly is not too big a deal, right? You could have written your info YAML file and that basically would have done it. But again, it's nice when it's simple like that. If you were doing some of the other things, like you want to mess around with some tests or the templates, it's nice to have a kind of starting place before you get going. So the next thing we need to do is we need to generate an entity. I think that's it. And this is going to be somewhat similar. I'm going to go through, answer some questions, and it's going to spit out some code. So here we have thingy, and we will be thingy. Same, the same, same. I'll just take the defaults. We'll let it have bundles. Why not? Sure. Is it revisionable? It should be. Why not? And base path will be fine. Now this did a little bit more work. You'll notice here, it's actually created quite a few more things. I wonder if I can make this a little larger for you guys. Does anybody know of a good way to do that? Or I'd have to go in and mess with the font sizes.
I think involves spacebar. I know it's weird, but that was a command plus. It doesn't work on PHP Storm. It's something else.
No, I think I have to go in and mess with the font sizes.
There's a shortcut, but I don't know what it is.
Okay. Well, is this good enough? We're not going to get too deep into this. This should be fine.
I can't read anything from here, but I'll just listen.
Up here.
You could actually, yeah. Okay, well, most of the code we're going to be looking at is going to be bigger, and it's going to be in the slideshow, and I'm just cutting and pasting it over. So we shouldn't have to worry too much about that. So at this point, let's see if it works. So we're going to enable thingy.
Control mouse wheel.
Control mouse wheel.
Enable control mouse wheel. So. Or this.
Do you have a mouse there?
I don't have a mouse.
Yeah, mouse wheel.
Oh, we're fine. Yeah. It'll be okay. Cool. So now we've enabled it. Nothing has blown up yet. So that's good. And let's go check it out in my local dev environment. This I can make quicker. Okay. So let me log in. We will see what we see. So right now with the custom entity that I just created is pretty bare bones. I didn't do anything crazy. I didn't do anything fancy. And as a result, I really don't have a whole lot of cool stuff. I can go in and I can add types of thingies. Those are the bundles, right? Just like the content type. And I can go in and I can add thingies themselves. And then I can add fields to thingies and do all the normal stuff. I don't have a type. I have to create that. So I mean, really at this point though, the only thing I've done is I've kind of created the node entity without any of the node stuff that usually goes with it. So not horribly useful. I mean, I suppose this could be handy if you, for some reason, wanted to have a completely separate entity for storing data, or you were going to tie into it, or maybe I'm going to take this now and I'm going to, you know, add some different functions that do different things on pre-save or post-save or whatever I'm going to do. But that's the next piece. So right now, I think the most important thing is that we did actually get a custom entity created and enabled in less than 5 minutes. So I think that's good, right? Okay.
So the rest of it from here would be exported to config?
Could be, yeah. And then you could pull that, take the config and stick it in your module and do all the stuff you want to do. Okay, so very cool, but not overly exciting. So let's talk a little bit more about creating a custom entity. In this case, the entity that I'm going to be creating, I'm just calling an asset. It's basically like asset injector in D8, although when I originally created this, that didn't exist, or like CSS injector in D7. So the idea is that you can add anything, CSS, JavaScript. You could potentially add like a, use it to store like CSS images, whatever you like. We want to go through and do the basic stuff, make it revisionable. That's one problem I have with Asset Injector. I mean, in production, it's gross to do that with CSS, but if you're doing something quick or you don't have access to the code base or you're doing a quick demo, it's not nice. What I don't like is that Asset Injector is not revisionable. So if I change something and screw it up, I can't go back. So that actually is kind of cool. The other thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to, as part of that, is we're going to take the code, we're writing it through the UI, it's going to save it in the database, but then we're going to actually save it down to the file system, the public file system. That way it can be wrapped up when the rest of the CSS is aggregated, and it's not going to require going to the database to get it. And then finally, we have to attach those, just attaching a library in D8. Of course, we don't know now what those files are going to be called or even necessarily where they're located yet. So that's going to be an interesting piece. But what I liked about this approach is that it gives us the ability to have a custom schema. We can go through and we're going to have to write some stuff around some custom functions on how things are done, what happens when you save. We're going to have to deal with the file system. So we get to explore that a little bit. And we're going to talk about libraries and how you attach those and deal with those. So it's actually a pretty solid example. So the basic idea is we're going to do exactly what we just did. Generate a module, generate an entity, and then we're going to go in and we're going to start taking our custom code and sticking it into place. And as I mentioned before, all of my code snippets are actually in the slideshow. So we're actually going to build it, and I'm just going to cut and paste. It should work unless I screw something up, but hopefully you guys will be watching and let me know if I missed something. So what we need to do is we're going to have to define the database schema, which defines which fields the entity has. We're going to create an interface, although that's kind of not necessary. It's just kind of a stop point, because at this point, nothing else is going to be using that interface. We could skip that, but I think it's a good thing to keep in mind as you're going through developing your modules. We're going to have to add some methods to the entity to do some of the interesting things that we want. And then we're going to have to do some stuff on install to make sure that when we go save those files, that there are folders there that are ready to take them. We're going to have to write the code to save the files, attach the libraries, and then hopefully it works and doesn't blow anything up. Sound like a plan? So step one, you guys already know this step. We generate the module. Actually, I can just do this. Look at that. And this time we'll just call it asset, just because that's easier. Okay, same machine name. Good. Yes, we need a module file. No. That. We don't have any dependencies right now. Don't have tests in this or templates, although that would be kind of cool. And we'll generate. Go. And let's do this again. Now, in theory, at some point in the future, writing code is going to be as easy as this, right? Computers are going to be able to do all of it for us. Okay.
All the other word. Yeah, that's it.
It's okay. They'll need us for something else. Don't worry. Okay. One thing I don't like about this, I'm not going to mess with it now because you have to mess with the links and you have to do some other weird stuff, is where it's sticking it. But it doesn't really matter because we can change that later. We're not going to, but we could. No bundles, although that is an interesting question, right? One of the things I thought about with this exercise was, I'm not using bundles here, but that is an interesting point. Should I split out the CSS, the JavaScript, and CSS images or whatever other assets I want to add as bundles? Because then they could add additional functionality and fields on top. I'm not doing that, but it's an interesting question. We don't need to translate. And revisionable, please. Awesome. Great. So now we just did the exact same thing that we did before, only now we have things are called asset instead of thingy. Okay. Now the fun begins. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to go in and add, modify the base field definitions and make sure that we have the fields that we need. So if I jump back over here, man, this really is ridiculously small.
You can pinch to zoom.
Oh, did you figure that out while we were?
Yeah, I can with it.
Good man. Look at you, saving the day. On both sides? No. Okay. Thank you. That is helpful. So I'm going to actually, where are we? I'm going to close my thingy, open my asset. And you'll notice we've got all of this stuff here ready to go for us, but the thing we're going to be most concerned about is the actual entity that we created right here. Oh, that's fantastic. Okay. So on this section for the base field definitions, you can see it's already put some stuff in place here. So the basic boilerplate, who the user is, the name of this actual entity. We can whether or not it's published, and created and change date. Nothing too exciting there. The thing that's really cool about this is that we actually have the ability to go through and do more than just define the schema. So if you'll notice some of the options that are already set here, like if you look at name, we've got the field settings for that particular field. We also have some different options that are put in place for both the view as well as the form display on what those settings are. So you could go in after the fact and make changes to these things, but it's kind of cool that you can modify this stuff as you're defining it. And then of course, as you're going through your development, you're gonna tweak it and come back and refine this stuff over time. And in fact, that's the thing I found was the drush PM uninstall asset and then drush enable again was like my best friend until I blew things up, which is going to happen. That's why you want to have a dev environment that's not your main. So you blow up that. And then once it's relatively stable, then you can pull it into your main and go to town.
I learned drush config delete last week.
Hey, there you go. So the first thing that we got is we need to actually have a place to store the CSS or whatever it is we're using. We're going to add a content field here. Long string, we've got our descriptions. We're making it required. We're making sure that this particular field is revisionable, no default value, and then we've got some information on how it should be displayed. And then we're going to be able to configure how that's displayed on the actual display, the view display, so like the view mode, for example. Nothing too crazy about this, right? We also need to go through and put in what type of asset. This is where I potentially could have done a bundle, but I thought that was a little bit overkill. In this case, we really only, it's just a This would be the same thing as a select list if you were adding a field through the UI. And in this case, we only have two values, CSS and JS. Again, nothing that you haven't seen. It's just maybe a different way of doing it. Then I believe this is the last one, and this is the URI for actually accessing the file. This is what's going to tell Drupal where the file actually lives. And you'll notice that it's URI. So we could have potentially done a URL, but what I wanted to do was to be able to rely on the fact that you could use the whatever file system you had set up. So public, private, S3, other, whatever it is. I think that's a lot more flexible and probably a good way to go. Some interesting things here, some little cool things I found, like add constraint. So it actually has to be unique, which is going to be on the entity validation, which is cool. So it'll take care of that for me. It's not translatable. It's not revisionable. It just is what it is for right now. And it is case sensitive. So cool stuff. For this stuff, I went through, and there's not a lot of really good documentation like existing out there on this. So pretty much what I did is I went through and looked at a bunch of core modules and other modules, and that's how I figured out what some of my options were and what those things did. And luckily, I mean, if you're looking at this, most of it is kind of self-explanatory. And there weren't many instances where something didn't do what I assumed it did, which is honestly one of the things that's really great about Drupal 8. It makes a lot more sense. You know, in Drupal 7, you have to learn how things are, and then you have to learn the quirks, and then you have to learn the things that don't work the way you would think they should work because we haven't gotten there yet. Drupal 8 has tons of warts, but not as many, and they tend to be smaller. So I'll go ahead and save that down, and we're good. Any questions about that so far? Pretty straightforward. So before we get going into all of the actual methods that we're going to use for this, remember I said we were going to go through and modify the interface. Now, right now, I'm only going to be adding 3 methods to the interface, and the ability to grab what the type is, JS or CS, the file name, my global.cs, and then the file URI. So I can actually grab and do what I need to do. At this point, like I said, I'm not expecting that there's going to be any other integrations because this is just an example. But again, we could go through and change these things and add stuff if we needed to later. So let's add the interface file. And you'll notice that there's a lot of things that are already in here. And this is another thing to think about too. So what I'm not doing in this particular demonstration is I'm not kind of going through and cleaning out any of the boilerplate and getting rid of the stuff I don't want. A lot of this stuff, depending on what I was trying to do, I might go ahead and just do that because it's got stuff in here that I probably wouldn't need. But we don't have to worry about that right now. And in fact, I think that's one of the big things that stops a lot of people when they start doing development is they forget that we're supposed to be agile now, and they fall back into like a waterfall mentality where we try and figure everything out and plan the whole roadmap and get it all worked out at the same time. And it's an easy trap to fall into. So my advice is to focus on trying to get something that just works and then kind of go through and tweak it and clean it up. And once you have it, that MVP that's pretty stable, then take a look at your list of all the other, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this kind of things, and start working those things in. You'll get, it's a lot more, I think it's probably more efficient, but I know it's a lot more productive for me to actually have something that works, and then it's exciting, and then I want to keep working on it, rather than spending 3 times as long making something that would be really cool if I really ever finish it, and then I just I'm just tired of this and whatever. So hack your brain, make sure that you're staying excited about this stuff. Okay, step 4. This is a little small, but not too bad, because what we basically have to do is the methods that we're adding for the interface, we now have to make sure they're added to the actual entity itself. so that if and when something calls them, there's something for it to call. And this is really where the actual kind of coding starts to begin. Everything up until now has just been kind of getting things set up, laying the foundation. Now we're actually getting in it and making stuff happen. So I'm just going to add it to, I like to keep my field definitions at the bottom. So we'll put this stuff here. I'm just going to drop these in, and we'll kind of take a quick look at these. So the first thing that we've got here is that we want to get the type. And you'll remember down here, type is the field that's CSS or JS. So all we're doing with this method, so if we called up the asset, it'd be asset get type, and it would return CSS or JS. So we're going to get that field, return the value. I mean, that's about as simple as it gets, right? You've got a function that just returns a value. Then it gets a little bit more complex, and now we're going to actually get the file name. I might have called this something different, like generate file name, because that's actually what I'm doing. I'm not retrieving it, but I'm lazy, so get is fewer characters to type. And so what we want to do is we want to grab the name of the actual file, and actually the name of the asset could be anything. It could be my new CSS or adjustments for the home page. It could have spaces. It could have weird characters, etc. We want to then add that extension onto the end of it. So myamazingcss.css. Then just to make sure that it's going to play nicely with file systems, we're going to make it all lowercase, and we're going to strip out anything that's non-alphanumeric and replace it with an underscore. And this code is basically I stole it from in core where we do machine names for things. It's slightly modified because I made it I took out like one extra line that I didn't think was necessary. But I mean, that's that same thing, right? I didn't know how to do something, but I knew Drupal did. So I just went and found out where it did it, and I took what I wanted, which is great. And then the last step is we actually put the file name and the extension together. And so now we have my underscore awesome underscore stuff dot CSS. So now, regardless of what the asset is or how it changes or what it's called, we can generate a file name. We're going to do it the same way every time. So whether we're saving it or retrieving it, it should be the same. And then finally, in this last one, get file URI, we've got the file name. Well, now we can generate it, so that's easy. We know the type, and we're going to use that for the subfolder that it's going to be living in. And so then we know that this is where it's going to live. And right here, I've just hard-coded it to be in the public file system in the assets folder. Now, in the grander scheme of things, that's a potential limitation, and it'd be better if we could choose what the file system was, and if we could potentially choose what that subfolder is, maybe. But again, focusing on MVP, this is a great thing. I can drop in, an @to-do comment here, and maybe I'll get to it, maybe I won't. Pretty good so far? Okay. That's exactly how this entire session should go. 90% of this should be, yeah, that makes sense, right? Are we good? Okay. But you see how each piece is simple. You don't have to worry about the rest of it, right? And then you'll see how they kind of add together. And this is a change from kind of the way a lot of Drupal 7 stuff is done, where you have usually a lot more complexity. There's a lot less uniformity in your approach. Here, we're really trying to focus on getting those methods to be very simple. And in fact, this is probably my third or fourth iteration overall, where I actually went through and made things even simpler. Like I took one file, I was like, you know what, if it's more than like 5 lines in that method, I should probably break it into something else, because this is so simple. It shouldn't be that huge.
So this is cool with Drupal 8, but if you're not familiar with OO or interfaces or something like that, you have an additional step to sort of understand what an interface is, methods are, and that kind of thing. So I don't know if you have a good recommendation for OO tutorials. I mean, there are a lot of object-oriented tutorials out there.
Yeah, there are tons of them.
If you haven't seen OO before, that's almost half of what you're doing here.
Oh, exactly. That's what this that you see right there, this means it's talking about the object that you're working with now. And you're right, there's tons of object-oriented stuff out there. Honestly, what I found most helpful was to go and start to read some of that stuff until it really wasn't making sense anymore, and then go and play with some code and see how far I could get. And then I would learn something or have a question, and then I'd go back and read some more. It's like, oh, now this makes sense because I have context.
So you could actually go and learn OO by itself, independent of Drupal, perhaps PHP environment like PHP, and learn basic OO functions, interfaces, overloading methods, all those words that.
Dependency injection, yeah.
So,
this is not unique to Drupal at all. In fact,
and it's not trivial if you haven't seen it.
Right, no, it's much scarier to look at than it is to do. Especially if you've got a cheat kit like Drupal console that does the scaffolding for you, and you just have to worry about the piece you want. But I was actually looking, you're talking about the serverless stuff. I was looking at some sample code a week or two ago, and I noticed if you look at the code, there's, I think, Java and Go and Python. And it looks familiar if you know object-oriented. And I think Java was actually the closest to PHP that I saw. So it was like, oh, I know what that means. I don't necessarily know what those individual function calls mean. I could look them up, but once you know the patterns, they repeat often. Alrighty. So we've added the interface methods, and we're just going through that recipe that I'd created. And often when I'm doing some custom code like this, that's kind of what I'll do. I'll make an outline of the things that I need to do and the steps in the order that I'm going to work through them in. So this is actually similar to the flow that I had in my mind as I was writing this in the first place. I had the type, I had the name, and I had the URI. And when I got to this point, I was like, oh, you know what? That folder doesn't exist. I should probably make sure that it exists and then it's put in. And so I just go step by step and do each little piece. So the first thing we have to do for this, though, is that we've got to make sure that when this module is enabled and installed, that it's going to go and create that folder structure that I need. So for that, I need to create this install file. So I'm going to go back to the root of my module, and I'm going to create a new file. And the module name is asset, and the file is a .install. Now, the good news for folks that come from D7, this is going to be incredibly familiar to you because it is very largely unchanged. First thing is we've got this hook install. Is everybody familiar with the concept of hooks in Drupal? Anybody not? Mostly. So in Drupal, we have these kind of magic functions called hooks. And it's called that because in this case, we're using hook install. You replace hook with the name of your module, in this case, asset install. And so what's going to happen is that at certain points in Drupal's runtime, it's going to look for things that have this special name. And that's how it's going to know how to do it. So same thing with like a hook form alter or hook node load or any of those, although we don't really use those too much anymore. And so in this particular case, all I want to do is, as soon as this module is installed, I'm going to go through and I'm going to create. So I'm setting whatever the file default scheme, which is going to be public. I'm going to say that this public asset, whatever the public file system is what I need to create. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to create it using the file prepare directory function. Again, this is something that I stole from image styles in core. And then I'm doing the same thing for /CSS and /JS. So again, there's a lot of room here where I could go through and improve this. I could, instead of doing it like this, I could loop through and look at what those types were in the schema and use that to define what was being added so that It didn't matter how many types I added over time. My module would keep up. You'll notice on the other side, I was hard coding public, and here I'm using file default scheme. So what if that changes? What if we make private the default? That can screw something up. But again, what we really care about is just getting something that works today, and we'll get it going tomorrow. The next step is we actually want to go through and make sure that we're removing these folders when we uninstall. And again, I did the hook install. I went over and I installed my module. And then I was like, oh, cool, look, it created the folders. That worked. And then I uninstalled the module, and I was doing some other stuff, and I came back and was like, oh, crud, those folders are still there. I need to make sure that I'm doing garbage collection. So then I went and I did the hook uninstall. So it's that same process. You just go through and you try and think your way through it, and then as you get in, you're invariably going to forget things. And so you just go in and do each little piece. In this case, there's a lovely function called file unmanaged delete recursive, which I think also I got from the image styles in core. And it takes care of everything. You just say the public asset folder and everything underneath it. Get rid of it. So it's always nice when you can just have a single line of code there. Which, as we're starting to work with the file system, you can see there's a lot of power here and stuff that it's doing. And we're going to see some more of that as we keep going. So now we've got a way to determine what this asset's going to be called. We can store it through the UI. I could actually go and start putting assets in through the UI right now. If I turned it on, that's all ready to go. We've got a place to put it, but we don't have the stuff that's actually adding it. So now we need to go through and write that. So the first thing I've got here, and we'll jump back over to my asset.php, the actual entity, is to save it as a file. So this again is pretty simple, and you'll notice, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but you'll notice that as I'm going through and adding these methods, a lot of times I'm using the one that I just created in the next one that I did. So in this case, we're using the get file URI method that we just created right above. And that's how we're getting the name. We're grabbing from the database the actual content. That would be the CSS that we've entered into the user interface. And then we're going to do file unmanaged save data, and we're going to stick the content, save it in that place. And if it already exists, we're just going to overwrite it. Now you can use file managed save data. If you're doing it unmanaged, then you're just sticking a file out there. And Drupal's like, it's out there, I'm done. If you do managed, Drupal's actually going to create a file entity and is going to track that in the UI for you, which is very cool. But I don't want to do that because I don't need to muddy things up with that. I want to manage everything within this module, and I don't want to confuse anybody. They can see, well, why is there a CSS file in my files? I didn't do that. That must be those Russian hackers again. Okay. So now that we've got a way to save the file, we should also have a way to delete the file, because we're going to need to do that at some point. And this is kind of a similar thing. Here, actually, this is the first time so far we actually are passing through a parameter. In this case, if it's empty, we're just going to generate it automatically based on what the asset is called. However, I wanted to make sure that we had that in place because there may be times when it might have a different name, or we might want to call it differently, or different things can happen. So this is just kind of hedging my bets here. And then file unmanaged delete. I mean, seriously, this is like ridiculously easy. Of course, under the covers of what's going on with all this other stuff is ridiculously complex, but we don't have to worry about that. We let Drupal worry about that stuff. So one thing I noticed, and actually I don't think I have this working quite right. Actually need to tweak this, is of course after I save the CSS, I want to make sure that it automatically clears the aggregated CSS so it'll show up again. I don't want to have to manually do that every single time. So I've got a clear file cache for clearing out the CSS and JavaScript. I took that from the clear all caches function in core, and it's actually a little bit longer than that, but I just took out the pieces that I need, although I think that this is actually not working. Yeah, Drupal flush all caches is where I grabbed this from. But that's okay, you get the idea. So now that we've got all that stuff done, the next step is we actually have to go through and we have to put some of these things in place. So one of the things that we've got here, to kind of take a step back, is that you'll notice we created this, this object, this class asset, by extending revisionable content entity base, which is a base class which I think inherits from content entity base, which I think inherits from entity base. So there's levels of inheritance going all the way down. What that means is that any of the methods that are available for revisionable content entity base are also available here, even if I haven't explicitly defined them. And if I do explicitly define them, I can actually overwrite them, which is actually a very cool thing. So for example, if you wanted to create something like a node, but you wanted to change the way that nodes did things, you could actually extend the node class and then overwrite those functions with your own. And so that's why object-oriented programming works so well. In Drupal 7, the only way to really do that kind of stuff is either using hooks or by hacking, which can get messy. The nice thing about object-oriented programming is we actually have the ability to completely change anything upstream and override it if we need to. So one of the things that we've got in here, and actually this is actually relatively new, about 6 months or so ago, this got put into the scaffolding, is they actually did put these, the pre-save, and I think there may not be a post-save in this one. I won't pull it up now, but if you go dig in Drupal core and you take a look at the revisionable content entity base and the content entity base and the entity base, in there you'll see there are other methods that are being called and things that are being used. And that's always a good idea because you want to know what's available and you also want to know what's going on. You don't have to worry about everything else, just those individual pieces you need. So one of the things that is available that is not listed is the post save. And to keep with my pattern, I'm going to keep it with the other code that I've added. Here we go. So post save is a method that already exists on the parent class. So by defining it here, I'm actually overriding it, which is great because now I can add my own stuff. The problem is there's probably other stuff that it's doing that I don't want to get rid of, unless I explicitly choose to. So the lovely thing is I don't have to get rid of it. And that's what this first line is. So basically the first line in this method is to call the method on the parent and do whatever else it does. So in my post save method, step one is I'm going to do whatever my parent's post save method is and then do my stuff. Although I could also switch that around. I could do my stuff first and then do that stuff, or vice versa, mix it up. But this is great because I don't have to worry about what's happening in that post save method. I don't have to know all the specifics, and I don't have to worry about if that's doing something else that some other module is relying on, and now all of a sudden it's not there and it's going to break something in a way that I don't expect. I don't have to go down that rabbit hole. All I can do is say, for right now, whatever it does is fine. And in addition to that, I want to do my save file, which is, again, function method I just created. And then I want to do the clear file cache. So now every time I save or create a new asset in UI, it's going to go through and save the file, and it's going to go through and clear the cache. In the same vein, there's a post delete method, which you guys can probably guess what I'm going to do there. Basically, I'm going to go through and I'm going to run my delete file function. So now I've got both ends covered. I'm going to be creating the file when it needs to be created, and then I'm going to be deleting it when it needs to be deleted. Pretty nice. Any questions so far?
You overload as well as override? Could you cast it to different types and do different things with the same module?
Like what do you mean? Like what's
Like reuse this for different entities as you fed it. Like you're designing it for one thing, but you could do it at a higher level and just overload it inside so that it would perform the same function but on different types of entities.
So if I was going to do that, I would inherit this one. So I would like extend the asset entity. Like if I wanted to write stuff to files, for example, I would extend the asset entity. I mean, I suppose you could.
No reason to.
Yeah, but I mean, if I was going to go that route, I would probably abstract it more, and then have my asset inherit from that, but be specific to CSS and JavaScript, and then that other one, maybe it's writing text files or PDF files or whatever it may be.
I didn't know if that worked in PHP. I've done some Java too, so I didn't know if that was done in PHP or not.
There might be a way. That could be something cool to investigate and to come back and do an ADEC about.
And in a way, he's already doing that with the revisable whatever thing.
The revisionable,
The revisionable is
content entity base.
Is a inherited inheritor from another one.
Right, actually.
So I mean, it's already there. I mean, so yeah, what you're talking about is there. It's just that you would, yeah. I mean, so it should work.
Yeah, I just don't know if it can
How you
go.
would do it is another question.
Yeah, I just don't know how you go the other way.
I didn't have
Like
why I
upstream.
would do it. I was like, I wonder if that would do that the same way.
And you just create another layer. I mean, they're just layers of objects.
It's entities all the way down.
Yeah.
But
That's
that's-
all good as long as that one you're trying to inherit from has everything modular, like is broken out. It's a really good argument to have all your functions do one thing.
That's exactly right.
Because if they're not, then you can't overwrite those functions to do what you want. You have this function, this monolithic thing that screws you over and you can't.
Yeah.
Break it in ways that you don't know you're breaking it in.
Yeah, you can't, it makes it unreusable really unless you just break it.
But I like the question because that's what hackers do, is they ask questions and figure out how to do stuff that shouldn't be done. Okay, we're getting pretty close to the end here. We've got the ability to create the files, add the files, do all the cool stuff we need, but now we need to figure out, once we've created a file, or an asset, excuse me, and then it creates a file, we need to add that and attach it to pages. Has anybody attached libraries in Drupal 8? Yeah, it's kind of weird. It's not quite as easy as it was in 7, to me. I mean, that's maybe me. It makes sense. I understand why it's done. It just feels like it's kind of a pain, although it works pretty well in this case. So in order to do that, we're going to actually have to go to my trusty, handy-dandy module file that the scaffolding created for me. Now, the problem here is that the module file has no idea about the entities that we're creating. It's kind of dumb. The module file just knows about whatever kind of publicly expressed functions exist outside of particular objects. And so if I try and ask, Drupal at this point to go grab me one of my assets, it's going to be like, oh. So we have to define where we're going to get that information from. So we have to have a use statement. In this case, the use statement is for this particular module. So it's the asset module. It's the we're looking for an entity, and the entity is called asset, which corresponds to over here in the file system, where we've got the asset module, src source, and then entity, and then asset.php. Is that PSR4? Is that right? It's a naming convention. used in object-oriented programming. A little bit simpler than the PSR 0 that we started with. Works out pretty well. So now what this means, and I actually already had one there. I should probably put it in place with the other one. What this means is that now this module file will now be able to lazy load this code when I need it, how I need it. Because in Drupal 7, you could pretty much call any function that existed at any point in time because they were all there. Like when Drupal starts up and bootstraps, it looks at every single module, all the code that it has, every single function, and it's there, which is super handy because you can just call them. The problem is every single time you boot up, everything you do, you're carrying around all that baggage. So the nice thing about object-oriented programming, and especially in D8, is we're getting a little bit smarter with this. The upside is that we don't have to load every single thing on every single page and every single request. So I don't know if you guys have tried like checking out you know, Apache Bench or anything else with Drupal's API. It actually gets ridiculously fast when you're making like a bunch of calls on something simple, because it's especially if it's just returning JSON, it doesn't have to render anything, because it's basically calling the database, formatting into JSON, and spitting it back, and then of course it's cached. So that's what enables us to do this stuff. In D8, you could do some of that if you used, there's a module called JS. Has anybody ever used the JS module? It actually creates, you have to put in a file in your doc root called js.php, which lives next to your index.php. And what js.php allows you to do is, instead of using hook menu, you use hook.js in your module. And it goes through, and for each route that you define, you actually define what level of bootstrap you want it to take. Like just the basics, or you want to get in the database, or you want to get access control, or you want to do like rendering stuff. Not quite as elegant as this, but it was the same idea where in that approach, you actually do have to go through and define, these are the explicit modules, these are the explicit include files that I need to be loaded for this particular route. This is a lot more elegant, but it gets us there. So this is where it kind of gets a little weird. Because typically when you're in Drupal 8, when you're trying to load a library, you'll actually have a YAML file in your module that defines that library. And that YAML file is going to tell you like if it's JavaScript or if it's CSS, if there's any dependencies involved. It's going to tell you, where those things are located, etc. But here, we can't rely on that because we don't know how many assets we're going to have, what they're going to be called, or even potentially where they're going to live. So we have to generate that on the fly. Luckily, there's a hook library info build, which will allow us to do that. So basically what this does is, this is when Drupal's going through and it's looking at all of the modules and it's looking at those library.yaml files, and it's building its internal list of those libraries and what they're called and where they're located and all of that. It's going to call this hook. And so instead of looking at a YAML file, the hook is going to generate the same thing. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm generating this library blank. So it's got the placeholders for all of the things that it's looking for, but there's nothing there. And then here is kind of where this magic happens. This is where I'm actually instantiating the asset and I'm loading up all of the assets that happen to be there. Maybe it's 0, maybe it's 1, maybe it's 50. We're loading them all up. And I didn't create the load multiple method. I don't know if you guys noticed, but that's because it's already built in. It was one of those that I don't have to worry about. So now what I've got is I've got an array of objects. These are asset objects. And what I have to do is I'm going to pass, and I'm going to loop through this array. And for each one of these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the information I need for each object. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the type. So as we said before, this is pretty simple. It's just asset, get type. Then I'm going to get the path. Once I have that, I'm just going to determine if it's CSS or if it's JavaScript. And then based on that, I'm just going to go through and put it in that placeholder and start filling out that, that array the way that I need it to be. So now it doesn't matter how many I create, when I create them, what I call them, how that changes. The system is going to automatically build that library list based on my list of assets for me, and it's going to do it regardless of what they look like. Make sense? This wasn't very tricky to figure out, but there was a little bit of fiddling with it to get some of the stuff right. And then going back and forth and trying to refine it and make it look a little prettier and all that fun stuff. Because pretty code does matter, honestly. It's important. So at this point, we've done the weird thing. We roll right back into what the kind of normal stuff is again. And so when we're going to attach that library to a page, I'm actually using, this is one of the default methods for doing that. This is brute force, and it's basically attaching it to every single page on the site. Again, we're thinking MVP because ideally, like Asset Injector or CSS Injector in 7, you'd want to be able to say, hey, let's only load this for specific content types or on specific paths or in specific themes. So if I was to add those features over time, then this might actually get a little bit more complicated over time. Or I might even use some other hooks to attach it in different places, or I'm attaching it to forms or whatever I'm doing. You know, sky's the limit. But the big thing is we want to get something that works, and then we can add complexity from there. We're getting close to the end, guys, I swear. Nobody fall asleep yet. Any questions so far? We doing okay? Okay? Yeah? Okay. Because you know there's a quiz, right, at the end?
I'm gonna fail it.
I'm going to sit next to Ron.
No, I would fail the quiz. Are you kidding? Yeah. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is I presented an early version of this as a webinar like a year ago, and somebody actually called me out on it because I hadn't done this yet. He was like, "Why do you have the get file URI? Because you didn't use it anywhere." I was like, "Well, that was one of those things I was thinking about, and I would probably use that because file names change, and I need to, or why was I storing it rather? Why am I storing the file URI if I'm never using it?" So let's say I go in and I'm going to create my CSS file, my awesome CSS. So it'll be my_awesome_CSS.css because that's cool. And this is great, and I'm adding my CSS and it's working. And then I decide that I'm going to change it, and I'm going to make another asset file. And this one, I'm going to take some of it out because it's not just going to be for everything. I want one for the global, and I want one for the home page. So I'm going to change my awesome CSS to global, and I'm going to take some of it and I'm going to put it on home page because that's smart, right? We're going to divide things up and make it nice and tidy. Well, the problem is that when I do that, my awesome CSS.css, as far as Drupal is concerned, it doesn't exist anymore. So when I go and I change the name and I save it, it's going to save that file down with that new name, global.css, but that old one, that my awesome CSS, it's still going to be there. Only now it's abandoned because it's an unmanaged file, so Drupal doesn't know about it. It no longer has that name. So even if I delete my global.css because I finally wised up and I'm going to pull it into my theme repo like I should do in the first place, it's still going to be living there until I uninstall and delete. And that's just not good. We got to do some garbage collection. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to create a method called dedupefile. And what this is going to do is we're going to look at the old name and the new name. And if they are different, then we'll delete the old one. So the old name we're getting from whatever's currently saved in the database. And the new name is the one that we just generate based off of whatever the current name is. Relatively simple. not too bad. But again, that's why we were storing that in the database, so we can come back and clean this up. So let's put in our dedupe. Make sure we're on the module. You gotta remember where you're living. Okay. So now this is in place. And we actually need to go through and make sure that this is going to put in a place that makes sense. So we want to make sure that we're deduping at a time in the process where we haven't saved the other file yet, and we actually haven't written to the database yet, because we have to make sure we have an old value and a new value to compare. And so the best place to do that is going to be in the pre-save. So we've got our asset, we've changed the title, we've changed the CSS, we click save. And before it writes it to the database, it's going to run the pre-save. As part of that, it's going to run the dedupe. It's going to say, oh, the name of this is now global.css. But I'm noticing that in the database, it's actually called myAwesomeCSS or myAwesomeCSS.css. Well, those are different. We run dedupe. We're going to delete the old one. Now we save it. Now it writes the new one. Everybody's happy. Make sense? And again, this is simply the process of going through, and I'm just going to add this to the end here. The process of going through and just iterating and going through and playing with it and turning it on, turning it off, seeing what happens, what doesn't happen, figuring out how to solve that problem, neatly, tightly, figuring out where that goes, and then you move on to the next issue. It's just solving one problem at a time. Okay, so at this point, if I've written everything correctly, if I've saved everything correctly, we should be good to go. So now we should be able to enable this. It should work. Or I miss something and it'll blow up. So this is kind of the fingers crossed moment. Okay, we want to enable it. It's going well. Hasn't blown up yet. And looks like it worked. So wow. Step one is good, right? We still got to test it, but so far so good. I got to tell you though, when you're writing a module and you're going through this process and it blows up all the time, like there gets a moment where you really do like have a moment of panic, like is it gonna work? Is it gonna work? Oh my God. But it's a really good feeling when it does. Okay. So let's refresh our structure page, because if you'll recall, this is where it lives now. Although I'm not too pleased about that. And there it is, my list of assets. Great. So let's go add one and see if this works. Call it my awesome CSS file, and wait, what was it? I remember now. Bardic is weird. I was trying to come up with something that I could change that would be visible. So I did the body, but Bardic overrides that in all these different places. So content maybe. Yeah, main. That'll be good, main. So we just want to make sure that we can test it and make sure it works well. So we'll just do, that should be visible, right? We'll see if the background changes red. And you're noticing that we can do revisions here. Now I don't have the infrastructure in place to go through and look at my revisions. Well, actually, I guess I do. Yeah. Drupal's even cooler than I thought. Yes, asset one revisions and asset one revisions. Lovely. That's okay though, because it works. So let's refresh the home page and just make sure. And that's where I said that my, I don't have my flush right. I should have fixed that. Okay. Pretty confident. I think this might work. Actually, if we look down here, we do have an asset folder with a CSS folder within myAwesomeCSS.css. So that should work. Refresh. And bingo! Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? Thank you. That's right, because I am not a designer, folks. I'm just a code monkey. So let's double check and make sure all the other pieces work. We'll change this to global. We'll leave that. Create a new revision just so we can see. Testing the dedupe. Save it. And we should probably go ahead and catch it to be on the safe side. And if we look, you'll notice that global.css is now there, and my awesome css.css is gone. So my dedupe works. Lovely how that happens. And if we look at one of the revision tabs, we get an error. That's fantastic. Okay. So that's the next thing on my list, right? So now I get to go through and figure out what that is. It's the gift that keeps giving. Awesome. Alrighty. That's good that it worked, right? Because otherwise that would have been really embarrassing. Okay. So this is a question that comes up all the time. After my Entities 101 talk, people were asking me, after my webinar, after my DrupalCon session, and even though I said this, I had 3 people come up and ask me about it. When does it make sense to create a custom entity? I'm sure everybody has different ideas about things. I have my own. So one of the first ones I think about is the schema itself. So I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about they have an integration with some back-end system. They're pulling information in to do stuff. And it's like there's like 200 fields or something per item, and there's a couple hundred items. So I said, yeah, you should use a custom entity for that, because it's going to be a bit of a nightmare to put 200 fields in your entity, but it's a heck of a lot better than having 200 or even more if you have revision turned on tables in your database for every single one of those fields that you need to create. I mean, that's a nightmare. The other good thing is here, and actually we can take a look, this is actually putting it all in the same table. So we look at assets. Let's just browse. You can see that all of the information that I've got, the ID, the log message, the actual content, which should probably be stored as a blob, but that's fine. All of this stuff is in one single table, which is pretty quick and pretty efficient. So if you're talking about the need to have a whole bunch of different fields, a custom schema starts to make more and more sense the more crazy and the more complex it becomes. If you need additional methods, so in Drupal 8, everything is an entity, but there are different types. So nodes or content entities have different stuff that happens when you save or you pre-save or you do whatever you're going to do. Taxonomy terms have different things. Comments do different things, and those are entities. Users do different things. So different entities have different things that need to happen. In my case, I need to write files, delete files, dedupe, check things, all this other stuff that you never do with a node. So I could have probably created a content type. I could have stored stuff there, and then I could have written some monkey code to go through and do stuff using some different hooks. That would have been an old school way. This is much simpler, and this is much more elegant. And the other thing to think about is sometimes stuff happens and you don't necessarily want all the stuff that goes with it. So like you might say, I want to add notes to different pieces of content. Well, that could be a comment field, right? But I don't want other things that do stuff on my site with comments to affect that. Or I want to do that, but I want to do something else with it, like I also want to push it out to this other system or have it send an email or do whatever it's going to do. Those are times when I start thinking about, does a custom entity make sense? Again, if you have additional workflow steps, things that you have to do as part of this that are on top of what's already happening, you might want your own. Or, as we said before, if you just want to extend the default methods, you're like, a node or a comment would be absolutely perfect here, except every single time on the post save, I want it to send something out to HipChat or whatever. Well, great. I'll just create a custom entity. I'll extend comment, And maybe the only thing I'm really doing is I'm adding something into Postsave to do whatever. That can also be cool if you don't want to have that live in a hook, which is everywhere, or you only want to load the code that calls hip chat or whatever when you need it as opposed to more often, etc. So those are the kind of things to think about. Luckily, it's a lot easier now to create custom entities than it used to be. Hopefully, you got that sense. Final notes here. As we were talking about earlier with object-oriented programming, I honestly believe the best thing to do is just get your hands dirty. So my slides are up. They're actually, if you go to DrupalCon Baltimore, this is the session up there. My slides are there. The code's up there. If you want to pull it down and play with it, but I would just highly recommend you just make something and just monkey about when you got a couple of free hours. Just get something done, get off the fence. And as I've been saying, start simple. You guys, anybody here know who Tim Plunkett is? Right. So Tim's he's a pretty heavy hitter in Drupal these days. Tim's actually the guy that got views in core, and he's ridiculously smart, and he knows Drupal probably about as well as anybody. But I was talking to him about it, and the way that he did it was very gratifying, because it's probably the way I would have done it, but I would have felt like a fraud. Is he went in and he took the views module and he basically added an info.yaml file so D8 could see it, and then he turned it on, and then something broke. And so he fixed whatever broke, and he turned it on again, and something else broke. And so he basically just kept doing that. He just kept going through and cycling, turning it on, seeing what broke, fixing that, until eventually he could turn it on, it wouldn't break. And then he'd go try and use it, and something would break. And what he ended up at the end of that process was he ended up with a modified version that worked and did what it needed to in D8. And I think at that point, he eventually ended up refactoring the whole thing anyway. But the point is, he took a very simple approach, even for something ridiculously complex like views. So if you've got something cool that you want to create, then I would suggest that you just create it and just know that the complexity will come over time.
Did he add you to testing, do you know, by chance? I mean, that seemed like that would be very important at that point, because it's now not breaking, but
yeah,
it won't be robust.
I would imagine so. I don't know if he did it at that point or later, but
I mean, at some point.
But the approach was I thought great. I was like, oh wow, that's probably what I would have done. It's lovely. So homework. I always give homework. That's why people never show up to my sessions. So the first thing to do is make sure you have Drupal console and go spin up a module and create a thingy entity and go play with it and see what that looks like, see how it works. Seriously, it'll take you like 5 minutes to create it and 10 minutes of monkeying around with it, and then you can throw it away and never play with it again. So if you did nothing else but that, it really does help to get your hands dirty. Go find a module that needs to be ported, maybe.
Oh, there you go.
Or find one that is almost there and needs some help or has some issues, or find someone to work with. Maybe it's like the Drupal Dojo or something like that.
Or your house.
If you have something that you're working on, you can let me know and I will help you if I can. And I will say that now, and that's pretty ridiculous. I say that all the time in meetings because I know most people won't take me up on it, but I kind of feel like it's dangerous to say here because somebody might.
Yeah.
So,
And it's going to be on the internet.
And it's the entire world is going to be calling me now.
Party at Ron's house.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. But hey, yeah, I mean, we could do a sprint. We can go through and work stuff out. You already know my process. Make a change, see what breaks, figure out how to fix it, go to the next thing that breaks. That's how I work. Lots of other resources out there, probably much better than this, but go check it out. Hopefully this gets a start. And look for an opportunity, right? Look for a place that makes sense to use a custom entity, even if it's simple. And if someone can pay you to learn, that's great. So follow best practices. It'll be good. You're not shortchanging anyone because you're not doing anything crazy. But every single time you do it, you'll get better and faster. Any questions?
Where's the code?
The code. If you go to the Baltimore DrupalCon site, It's on my session there, which is creating custom entities.
So you can do that right there in your browser.
Oh, that's a really good call. Look at you. I wonder if I can do this.
Make it bigger.
There it is, DrupalCon custom entities. And there's a video that's not going to do you a whole lot of good because it has the audio, but the video is stuck on one screen and doesn't change. So if you ever want to,
sessions were like that.
yeah. So if you ever want to like listen to me drone on, like if you're having trouble sleeping, or something like that, seriously, it's, you know, you could do that. I don't mind. And then on this page, there's a link at the bottom for the slides, and there's a link to download the exact module we just created. So, which will be exactly, well, it won't be exactly the same. Some of the methods might be a different place. I don't know. You guys can figure that out. Any other questions? All make sense? Was this helpful?
Yeah.
Useful to kind of go through that process a little bit?
That was pretty cool to listen to your train of thought.
Yes. Is that,
Usually you try to look at a module that is finished and polished, and things are so complicated because so many variants. I've been seriously thinking about creating a podcast or something with module creators and try to make them take you through the process, like how the hell this module started. Where is this simple first function that they created and how it evolved, because that way you get to learn.
yeah.
Otherwise, it's so complicated that you don't know where to start.
Well, and that's the thing. I think so many people just get discouraged because they look at something and it's like, oh man, I could never write something like that because they thought about everything.
Yeah,
and it's
these
like,
guys are geniuses.
it's like, well, no, actually, some of them did. Some of them are geniuses, and they did think about everything. And they probably wrote that would take me a month in like a day. But I think a lot of people are probably in a very similar boat where you do something and it's relatively simple, and then you add a little more and add a little more, and eventually you turn around and you look and you've got all these files and all this crazy stuff that's going on, and somebody else is asking you, is like, oh man, how did you figure all that out? It's like, I don't know, just did one thing at a time.
Cool. That was awesome.
You're gonna go make a custom entity now?
I'm not sure.
Huh?
I'm not sure that.
Maybe. Is anybody gonna create a custom entity now?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I love that it's streamlined and that you have everything, it's a sync in the database. I mean, and there's no extra stuff that you're bringing in, like you say.
Right.
I mean, you can extend stuff from core very easily.
Yeah, exactly, which is the idea.
I have a question. I mean, maybe I already know the answer, but if you want to save that configuration in configuration rather than in the database,
Oh,
is that hard to do? How much?
well, so I could have,
It'd be kind of weird to do with this, but
yeah, I mean, config entities are different. I haven't played with them too much, to be honest with you, because they're kind of their own little thing.
is there a Drupal console scaffold for that? You know, make a config entity as opposed to a
I
regular
think there is. Let's look.
So, the examples module.
Oh, that's a,
That's where I started with this one.
entity?
So
Okay.
I wanted to how to do that.
there you go. I think this will, but yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? You go find someone who's done it and you copy their code. So it looks like, yes, generate entity config.
Okay.
So you can create a new config entity.
I accidentally created one of those, trying to create one of these.
Oh, really?
I was like, this is not what I wanted.
What is going on here?
Yeah. Well, and then there's all the other stuff you can do with config. So that's the kind of thing that, you know, at work I wish sometimes they would do that. Just like, you know, 2 hours of playtime on Friday, go mess around. Like, okay, I'm going to see what these commands do. I'm going to go break my dev site and fix it. Yeah.
You can do that on Thursdays at the Drupal Dojo.
Oh, there you go. Always selling. Yes, sir.
Can I put you on the spot here?
Please.
You mentioned that the Drupal console isn't necessarily like installed. Is there like a fairly lengthy install process? Is it easy or?
No, you can use Composer, actually.
If it doesn't break,
Yeah,
I'm
it's-
trying to do it like on SSL or,
Last time I tried to use the Drupal console,
it gives you the command though, when you try to run Drupal console.
oh.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it-
Uh,
But if
I
you
didn't
try to
I
run
had other ways to do
Drupal
what I was
console,
doing,
it'll
but-
tell you that.
Yeah, you can.
Oh, yeah, you can run Drupal help or something like that.
No, I really
Let me see. I can.
tried to run the first thing.
Oops. Oh, I've jumped into my root here. I'm no longer in a Drupal site, and so you'll see I'm not getting that full list. I'm only getting some things because I have installed it in my system, but you have to install it like per site, which kind of sucks. But it says, you know, you need to run this against a Drupal root directory.
I just ran Drupal list.
So you have to
So
install
that
it
gave me the-
per site and globally?
I don't know.
What were you saying?
The recommended method is to install it per site. With Drupal 8 and the Composer stuff, you know, you're now supposed to install everything using Composer. So if you use the Drupal project, Drupal Composer starter thing, then it will actually give you your Drupal site plus Drupal console plus Drush. And it's all included once in your one
Yeah, it
thing.
provides a lot of feedback.
Now, what was
So-
that, Brandon?
Fix
What was that
whatever.
thing to do the installation?
Drupal Composer or Drupal project.
Well, so that installs an entire site.
Ah,
Yeah.
But then if you needed to install it on an existing site, then you probably some other instructions I need to look online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically,
Composer required Drupal console.
I think at the very least that will work.
So I
Uh,
should find it in my vendor directory. And if it's
Yeah.
not there, that's not gonna work.
There you go. Change, execute Composer required. And that's basically it.
I don't really see that's basically it.
Well, I mean, you know,
Either it works or it
Ideal
doesn't.
world.
Yeah.
Most time it works and sometimes it doesn't work.
and when it doesn't, you have a new problem to solve. It's great. You win either way.
Basically.
But I don't use Drupal console like for everything. Like most of my dev sites, I've got quite a few on here, don't have it. I usually just have it in one or two because I really only use it for stuff like this. I use Drush most of the time.
But in my case, it keeps on working even if I have it globally. I've never installed it. I probably did install it in one site once just to try things out, but I just use the global console. So far, it's been working.
See, that's what I did that before once where I had it set up globally and I didn't have to do it per site. But I thought I did the same thing when I reloaded my system a few months ago. And now I still have to do it per site. So I don't know.
Just in our recent releases where they added that requirement to install it per site.
Per site, so you might have an older version.
Oh, yeah, I installed it. I may have updated it, but I installed it.
Okay, cool. So there might be a way to do it globally. When you figure it out, then
I probably did the wrong way the first time I looked at it.
I've done it the wrong way about 12 times.
Yeah,
So
just dinking around and Googling.
Yeah.
that's the secret to my success. Awesome. That's right, total imposter. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you, man.